Good morning, everyone. I'm Joanne Koontz. I'm here with my partner, Jackie Durham. Today is July 20th. We wanted to bring to you today a discussion about commercial leases and some refresher and some provisions that you need to be mindful of if you are either a landlord or a tenant. If you have commercial property that you're thinking about taking space for, we'll kind of give you some pitfalls to avoid and things to watch out for to make it a little bit easier. So. As always, we record these webinars. They will be distributed on our Facebook page, on our YouTube channel, and on our website, KoontzAssociates.com and KoontzParkin.com. If you have questions, you're welcome to enter them at the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. So without further ado, I know Jackie has been mulling through standard and frequently occurring commercial lease provisions, and I'm sure there's a Bible to go along with that.
There certainly is. So yeah, just to kind of piggyback on what you were saying before, this is more of a refresher, but I did want to bring forward some provisions that I feel like are kind of lost in the shuffle. So these commercial leases are pretty long, and nobody's really interested in reading them but me. So
I can't get people to read an email. I don't know how you're going to get them to read a 50-page piece, but.
Exactly. Well, I mean, I need some coffee, but it helps. So what I would say is there's a lot of unassuming provisions that seem harmless or they're kind of taken for granted, but they can actually create some issues and they need to be addressed, and you need to be mindful when you're negotiating the lease to cover these terms. So some of these points that I'm going to touch on seem fairly obvious and straightforward, but you would be surprised what I find in my clients' leases after they've already signed, and after issues have arisen due to these provisions that they didn't pay any attention to when they were signing on the dotted line. So again, if there's questions after this, I'm happy to elaborate on anything further. I'm going to kind of do like a high-level overview of some of these issues, but I've seen my clients stumble into quite a few issues, so I can offer a lot of specific advice, if anybody has any questions about their particular commercial lease. So with that, I think the first point I want to start with is thinking about your tenant improvements and the level of investment that you're going to need to make to basically build out your commercial space for your intended use. A lot of times, folks just take whatever lease term the landlord is offering without negotiating that and without really thinking about the level of investment they're making on the front end. So depending on how much you're investing in your space, you need to be mindful of the lease term, because that 3 or 5 years, that's the maximum term that you're receiving. You don't have any guarantee that the landlord will renew your lease. So whenever you're in a position like that where you're making investments in the space, I definitely recommend making sure you have a nice healthy lease term, but also some options baked in as well, some options for extension. I think that's really beneficial to a business because it gives you that flexibility to take more time in the space if you need it, but you can also opt not to if you find an alternative space that will work better for your business. So if I'm representing the landlord, of course, I want the tenant to have the longest term possible and the fewest extensions possible. But usually you can negotiate something and find your way to the middle. So definitely want to be mindful of that whenever you're, at the outset negotiating the lease. So the other thing I want to mention is a lot of times there are provisions in the lease that require you to notify the landlord if you're going to elect one of your options for extension. And many folks kind of forget to do that. And they kind of take for granted in their mind, oh, I have a couple options in this lease, but they fail to actually exercise the option. What can happen there, and what I've seen happen to certain clients, unfortunately, is that if you don't exercise the option properly in accordance with the terms of the written lease, the landlord doesn't have to grant the option, and you've essentially waived that right. So unfortunately for some of my tenant clients, I've seen them take that for granted. They didn't exercise it timely, and the landlord decided to lease it to someone else who was willing to pay more because, what the current fair market value of rental is today may look different 5 years from now. So this option that you have at today's rate might be a lot less attractive to the landlord at the end of the term. So make sure you're paying attention to those deadlines that are buried in the lease. Another issue that I've seen happening more often actually is related to personal guarantees. So typically in a commercial lease, it's an LLC or a corporation signing off as the tenant and operating from the space, and the individual owners of those entities will sign a personal guarantee. Many times, the lease will be assigned to a new tenant should the original tenant decide that they need to move on to a new space, or if they decide to sell their business. But whenever this happens, if you are the tenant that is assigning the existing lease, you need to make sure that you are terminating that personal guarantee, or at the very least that the personal guarantee is being amended to expire on a particular date. Because what can happen is landlords out there, smart landlords, begin collecting guarantors, and they will just perpetually continue to assign the lease to new tenants, never actually terminating the original lease, just extending the term. And unbeknownst to the original tenant, they're on the hook for a lease that started out as 5 years. It's now 15 years, and they're one of 6 guarantors. That works really well for a landlord. That's a great strategy for a landlord. The more guarantors, the better, but that's not great for a tenant. So you really need to be careful to make sure that you are terminating that when you go to assign the lease. Don't assume that the landlord's going to sign a new lease at the end of the pre-existing term, because they can always extend it and amend the lease that way. So,
and because those are tied together, you're not necessarily going to see that to even be mindful of it. You really have to be watching out for that on purpose, because when you read the assignment, it's not addressing the guarantee at all. It's really a separate document outside of the lease agreement. So you really have to be intentional about that.
Right. And it's just another reason why you want to get with your attorney before you do anything, before you sign any legal document, because your attorney is going to be looking out for things like that. And, most guarantees aren't written from the standpoint of this is a personal guarantee that extends through this particular date. It's tied to the defined term within the lease. So if you keep pushing out that lease term, your guarantee term is also going to be pushing out as well, concurrently with that lease term. So the other thing I think is really important is, especially for, say, restaurants who utilize outside seating, a lot of times the lease doesn't actually provide that express right for you to use that outdoor space, or for you to use certain common spaces with other co-tenants. And a lot of tenants take that for granted. And then the landlord sometimes will pull out the rug from underneath them and say, no, you're no longer allowed to use this space. Well, I've been using this space for the last 2 years. Well, it's not in your lease and you're not entitled to use it. And I'm saying it stops now. So that can be extremely disruptive to a business who that makes up part of what they thought was the gross leasable area that they utilize for part of their business. So it's really important to make sure that if you intend to utilize certain common areas, certain outside areas, it's really important to specify that and include that express right in the lease. Also, just making sure you know exactly which space you're entitled to use, because if you have other co-tenants that are utilizing outside space, sometimes they tend to creep into your space, and it can happen slowly over time, and you need to be able to draw that line in the sand so that you know exactly what you're entitled to exclusive use of. And another issue that I've also seen, and Joanne, I'm sure you've seen this as well, especially with some of these new buildings, there might be units that don't have walls yet built in. So sometimes you have a tenant that goes in and they see a space, they think it's unit B. Well, it's actually what they're looking at is unit B and C. So it looks a lot larger than it actually is. And what you're actually renting and entitled to use ends up being smaller than you realize. So I also think that it's important to have a sketch of the leased area that you're entitled to use, just so there's no misunderstanding as to what you're actually getting. And also to make sure you're including the square footage in the lease as well. And I feel like a lot of leases are missing that information, and there can definitely be some misunderstandings that arise from that. Also, fixtures and improvements and equipment. This is a big issue that I run into on a pretty consistent basis with tenants who come to me after signing their lease, and especially at the end of the lease term. So you as a tenant have invested in different fixtures and equipment, and you're ready to let your lease either lapse or you're terminating the lease early. And now the question is, what do I get to take with me? And a lot of times the lease is either silent to this, or the description of what you're entitled to take is very loose. And what people consider to be trade fixtures can be very different. So what you may have anticipated as being your property that you get to take with you, some nice chandelier, some nice piece of restaurant equipment, whatever it may be, if it's not specified in the lease, you can have a pretty hard time arguing that with the landlord after the fact. And you know, you need to be careful and mindful of what you intend to put in the lease space, and to make sure that you're including that specifically in the lease, so that is your property, that you get to take it when you leave. Of course, you'll have to repair any damage to the lease space that it causes when you remove it. But it's really important to outline that, because I have seen that cause issues for plenty of people. So also, speaking of tenant improvements, something else that really needs to be outlined in your lease to make sure that you can do exactly what you need to do to the space to make it you know, right for your business, for you to utilize to the greatest extent possible for your business, is to specify the tenant improvements that you need to make the space work. It's really important to do that, because just because you're going in and you're going to be operating a restaurant or a boutique or a salon, the landlord still has the ultimate say so on whether or not you can make these improvements. And you can't take for granted that the improvements that you need for your business are going to be agreeable to the landlord. That needs to be outlined in the lease. Something else that's pretty common in leases is landlord credits for tenant improvements, allowances. And that's something else that needs to be specified. If your landlord is willing to make certain improvements before you move into the space, you need to make sure that the amount that they're going to be covering is very clearly outlined, and also the improvements that they're making is very clearly outlined, because a lot of times the client hands me the lease and I say, okay, let's look at the improvements that the landlord is agreeing to make, and we're missing a bathroom, or we're missing a wall. We're missing certain things that were discussed and negotiated with the brokers, but it didn't actually make it to the lease. The lease is the Bible, and that is what is binding on the landlord. So regardless of what you and your broker discussed with the landlord 2 weeks ago, if it's not in the lease, it's not going to be enforceable, and that can make or break a lease agreement. So I've also seen that happen a few times. Another thing I would keep in mind is, typically when you make these tenant improvements, there's also a provision in the lease that's going to require you to sometimes restore the property back to its original condition. That in and of itself can be pretty expensive. Mm-hmm. So you either need to negotiate that that's not a requirement for you, or you need to calculate that into the total cost of your tenant improvements, because you're going to get dinged with that on the tail end of the lease when things wrap up. So
the other thing,
another
thing to dovetail on that too, is you have to be mindful, if you are operating a franchise, sometimes they will require certain things to be provided in the space. So you may have to have a certain counter, you may have to have the layout a certain way, and so you may end up with conflicting provisions between your requirements under the franchise agreement and your limitations under the lease agreement. So that's just something else to be cognizant of before you select a space, particularly in fast casual restaurants. We're seeing a lot more like that coming around, and then those lease agreements hadn't really contemplated those types of concepts you know, in the standard agreements. So just something else to look out for.
Yeah, and you know, I feel like the franchise, I mean, you should always have an attorney assist you with the review of a lease, always. But it's even more important when you are operating a franchise, because there are a lot of provisions that are inherently in conflict with one another. You know, because the franchisor has to approve signage, they have to approve, you know, all the displays and things like that. There's certain standard uniform requirements, and those may be in conflict with your lease requirements. And I've seen that happen, you know, a number of times. So that's really important to make sure that you're comparing those two sets of documents side by side, and that you're getting approval for all those in advance, so you don't get too far into the lease just to find out that you know, can't do something that your franchisor is going to require you. another thing that I would highly, highly recommend, typically in a commercial lease, you're going to be assuming the maintenance and repair and replacement of most of the major systems: HVAC, plumbing, electrical, everything except basically the structural elements or the roof. So, you know, when you think about it, you're going to be occupying the space for at least 3 to 5 years, hopefully more if you have some options baked into the lease. And you need to look at it almost as like you're purchasing a property. You wouldn't purchase a property without having a professional inspection done. You also shouldn't step into a commercial lease where you're going to be assuming the maintenance obligations of the owner without also conducting a professional inspection. Because what can happen, and what I've seen unfortunately, is you sign on the dotted line, everything looks great, but you don't realize that this HVAC is on its last leg. So you sign the lease, you get in there, 6 months later, you're replacing the HVAC. And you know, what prudent clients and tenants typically do is have the inspection done. If we have any issues with the systems, those get addressed before you sign the lease, or at least we provide a provision for that or some kind of credit for that, so that you're not buying a brand new HVAC for your brand new lease space, you know, 5 minutes after signing the lease. That can happen, that does happen, and it's not fun. So just keep that in mind. Definitely want to do an inspection so you know what you're stepping into.
Yeah,
Also,
people have a tendency to feel like I'm not buying it, so I don't need to do that inspection. And we've seen several of them uncover, it's especially if you're doing a real short-term lease, like, you know, we see people now, they're in the middle of expanding space or moving into a different space, so they take something for a year, and it's like, oh, it's just a year. How bad can it be? Well, if the whole entire AC needs to be replaced in month 3 out of 12, and you haven't done any modifications, you're stuck with it.
Yeah, exactly. And you know, you also want to take a look at what you're agreeing to maintain as well. There are sometimes the provisions are written very broadly, and what I like to do is I like to tailor them in a little bit just to make sure that what you're agreeing to maintain from a plumbing standpoint or from an electrical standpoint only begins at the point at which it directly serves your lease space. You don't want to have to be on the hook for some, you know, burst pipe that's 50 yards out under the parking lot, because that has come up too, where it's really unclear what you're actually responsible for, and now the landlord's coming to you with their hand out asking you to pay for something that really doesn't directly affect your lease space. So that's another thing to be mindful of and careful of. Also, if you're operating in a shopping center, you need to really be prepared for the fact that, especially if you're leasing with someone like Benderson or one of these large lessors, that at any given point you can be relocated within that shopping center or relocated to another one of their shopping centers. The space should be specified to be substantially similar in size and quality, but you know, the location is what really can get people. Because sometimes you leased a space at this particular spot because you liked the tenants on either side of you, you liked the street you were on, you know, there was good, you know, frontage to a good street that you like, and then a year into the lease, you get moved to the back of the plaza. No one knows where you are. You now have to re-advertise your location, update all of your profiles, and you're in a less desirable spot. There's really nothing that you can do if you want to rent in a shopping plaza. That provision is always going to be in your lease, and there's really no negotiating that out unless you have a magic wand. But I've never seen a lessor remove that provision, so it's something you need to be prepared for. What I recommend doing though is making sure in the lease at least you negotiate some kind of allowance that you'll be entitled to if you have made substantial tenant improvements on the front end. So if you lease a new space and you invest a decent amount of money in the tenant improvements, and then 6 months later you have to move to a new location within the shopping center, you want to make sure you have some kind of provision in there to recoup your investment, because now you're going to have to do a whole new build out and you've lost the investment you made on the original space. And it's extremely unfair and heartbreaking to see happen to tenants. But it is a right that is exercised with some frequency by these lessors. So be aware of that and make sure that you're making provision to protect yourself and especially your investment in your tenant improvements. Another item that hours of operation, everybody glances right past that because they typically seem to be pretty standard hours. But what a lot of tenants don't realize is that the landlord will impose that restriction on you. So they will make sure in certain circumstances that you are actually operating in those hours. And sometimes those hours are not appropriate for your business. So you really need to take a look at that and negotiate that. A lot of my restaurant clients, they need to have a certain time of day where they can close down between lunch and dinner so that they can prepare for dinner. They need to have the ability to stay open past a certain point. And a lot of times we have to very carefully negotiate those hours into the lease because a lot of tenants don't pay attention to that. It's kind of one of those boilerplate provisions that they glide right past. But once you're in the lease, it can carry unintended consequences and can sort of tie your hands in a way that you didn't anticipate. And the landlord's not always going to look the other way and be understanding. These lease provisions, if you don't comply with, technically you're in default. So you want to make sure that you're intentional about provisions like that.
Absolutely. We also had several years ago, we had a situation where we had a candy store and they were required to be open till like 9:30 at night. And the guy was like, our business really stops like around 7. Like now I'm just paying people to keep it open to not be in trouble with the landlord. And this doesn't even make sense for my business model. This is not,
Exactly.
And the thing is that lease, you may say, well, I have a handshake with the landlord. If the landlord sells it and the lease gets assigned and the new owner decides to enforce it, here you go. So it's just best to have it outlined properly, what you really expect your operating hours to be. In fairness to the landlords, they don't want the place looking shut up, but maybe you're not in the right shopping center then. So maybe you need to be with more daytime operated businesses or something like that. So it's just also, sometimes it's a good thing to get like a decent mix of other tenants too. So.
Yes, exactly. And that is something that a lot of folks, especially if they've been leasing with this landlord for some time, say they've been with them for 10 years and they're using the same lease over and over again. And they're like, oh, it's been 10 years. I've never had a problem with Frank and he's a nice guy. And, I know it says this, but he never enforces it. Your point, Joanne, is a very good one, that you never know who the new landlord could be because this landlord could sell at any time and somebody a little less favorable steps in and all of a sudden these dormant lease provisions that have never been enforced are now being enforced. So, and you're on the hook for how much longer you have the lease term in effect for. Exactly. So also, speaking of these provisions that people just fly past, the indemnification provision that's included in most of these leases, I think is probably the largest pitfall for tenants because typically it's drafted very much in favor of the landlord. It's overly broad and you really need to take a close look at that because many times the indemnification is providing you as the tenant being responsible to reimburse the landlord for basically anything that could go wrong with the property. And oftentimes it's written in a way where even if the landlord is somehow at fault as well, that you're still required to fully indemnify the landlord. So you need to make sure that your attorney is tailoring that language to limit your indemnification obligations solely to loss or expense that arises from anything that does not extend to the landlord's own negligence. So if the landlord is somehow at fault, we want to draw the line in the sand there to make sure you're not indemnifying them for their own actions or omissions, which many times these indemnification clauses are drafted in a manner where you would be required to do that. So that's one of the main provisions that I feel like I fight over and wrestle with whenever I'm negotiating these leases. And it's really important to make sure that, you need to have a CGL, a general liability policy. You need to have business interruption coverage. And your CGL, typically the lease, it's going to require that you list your landlord as an additional insured. You want to make sure that not only are they listed as an additional insured for purposes of being indemnified by your insurance company, but you want to make sure that there's also a duty to defend included in that additional insured coverage. Because what can happen is sometimes these insurance companies will add the landlord on as an additional insured, but they don't include the duty to defend them in any kind of cause of action. And the attorney's fees that can accumulate in a legal action can sometimes get higher than the actual claim itself. So you need to make sure that you're including both of those. So you want to talk to your insurance agent and your attorney and make sure that both of those are included, so that you're fully covered in the event that there is some kind of accident or cause of action. So the the business interruption coverage, just to jump back to that real fast. Especially in COVID, everybody realized pretty quickly how important that coverage is. And it doesn't just extend to pandemics. If your principal owner gets ill, or there's some kind of accident, or something happens and you ultimately have to stop operations, you want to make sure that you have some kind of coverage in place to carry you, to cover your rental, to cover your insurance, to cover payroll. That's really important, and I feel like that's something that in the wake of COVID, everybody very quickly realized is a very important insurance coverage to have. But something else to keep in mind is the lease is also going to require that you continue to operate your business on a continuous basis during those particular hours. So if something unexpected comes up, even if you're still willing to pay your rental, you need to make sure that your lights are on and that your doors are open and that you have the space operational, because failing to remain operational can be a breach in and of itself under the lease. So you want to be really careful about that and kind of set up your business in a way that if something unexpected happens, that you can keep things moving. And business interruption coverage, I think, is one of the best ways to safeguard that. So and speaking of defaults, just want to touch real fast on making sure you are taking a close look at not only what amounts to a default. We all know that if you fail to pay rent, if you fail to be operational during the hours you're supposed to be operating, if you fail to maintain the property in accordance with the lease, all of that can trigger a breach under the lease. But recently what I've been seeing is the damages that the landlords can pursue is getting a little more lofty. So it's a given that they can pursue rental that's due under the lease through the end of the term. That's been kind of a standard damages provision that's been in commercial leases for a long time. But recently what I've been seeing is also liquidated damages provisions, which in addition to the balance of the rental due under the lease, the landlords are reserving the right to collect essentially a penalty. I don't know how enforceable that would be in court. That seems a bit aggressive, but it's in these leases. So you need to make sure that you're taking a look at that. And also just make sure that, many times whenever a tenant is having sort of a dispute with the landlord because they feel that the landlord is not performing their obligations, they automatically want to withhold rent or offset their rent payments by the damages that they think that they're incurring as a result of the landlord's breach. And you can't do that because essentially the landlord is still going to be in a position to pursue you for your breach by not paying them. And you're not even able typically to assert a counterclaim in that same action. Usually the lease requires that you file your own separate action against the landlord. So it becomes very costly and time consuming. So I would definitely recommend just continue to perform your obligations even if the landlord is defaulting on theirs. But one of the main provisions that, in addition to revising the indemnification provision, one of the main provisions that I try to include in these commercial leases, it doesn't always make its way in, but I try, is to include a provision that allows you as the tenant to terminate the lease in the event the landlord defaults and doesn't cure the default. Because otherwise, the way these commercial leases are written, if the landlord's in default, even if it's a very clear breach, in order to terminate the lease and walk away from the lease, you have to file an action with the court requesting that relief. So it's not quick and easy. The landlord has the right to terminate the lease if you don't perform, but you don't have that same right typically unless we carve it in there. So you definitely want to try to include that if your landlord's willing to let it, come in. And I've seen that personally with several tenant clients where the landlord is really abusing their rights. And the tenant spent a year in litigation just trying to get out of the lease. So that's
by the time you win, the lease is up anyway.
So, those are the main things. I wanted to come back and kind of offer a refresher of some of these pitfalls that we see in these commercial leases, and just offer some guidance because, these are things that happen with some frequency, and I've been seeing more often. And, they get buried in the lease in these 50-page leases, and a lot of these one-sentence provisions can really carry these unintended consequences. So you really need to be intentional when you're going through your lease and think about how that particular provision could affect you. And that's best done with the assistance of an attorney because we've seen a lot of these situations. So I know the pitfalls to look out for, and it can really save you a lot of time and headache and expense on the tail end when something goes wrong.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. One question that we do have is, can you please touch and discuss the core factor and how that should work? How do you calculate the additional square footage properly to include in a lease? I think that, Helene, are you talking about in terms of the common elements? I'm not sure if you're talking about common space. In terms of how that is paid for. So I'm going to need a little bit more to help answer your question. But when it comes to those, I guess to jump off of that until she comes back to us, the CAMs and how the other charges are calculated can vary vastly from lease to lease. Some leases have an obligation to kind of true up those CAM charges to you, and some just are charging a flat. Some are fixed lease rates, and some are triple net. So when it gets into the pricing, you have to really be careful about what you're paying today, what you're going to be paying at the end of the lease, and in any renewal periods. Helene says listing agents add more square footage than the tax records show. I see what you're saying. So that you could be paying for more. We do see that with some frequency. People get, we had this recently where the tenant was actually going to buy the property from the landlord after a lengthy time frame. And then when they did the appraisal, that's when they found out the square footage was less than what they had been paying on. Kind of caused a little bit of a brouhaha at the closing. But really, you can, when you have the property inspected during that inspection period,
yep.
You can have the square footage recalculated there, reconfirmed. You have to be real careful. A lot of times, even in residential, I have people who say, well, I looked at the county's website and it shows X. That's informational, but it's certainly not authoritative. So if there is a discrepancy and there is a concern, you're going to want to get somebody in there to get those measurements to make sure that you've got that hammered out on the front end, and to make sure there's nothing unexpected that can change. So,
right.
So Richard, Jackie and I do both work together. So I put her contact details in the panel bar because she's the one who's primarily reviewing the commercial leases. We don't really have like a standard fee for those. We will look at what you've got. There are some that we've reviewed before and we can say, hey, I know, what I'm up against when I look at this particular landlord's lease. Frequently people have a tendency to go, well, it's only 3 pages, so it shouldn't take you long. A 3-page commercial.
Well, it's going to take me 3 pages just to write out what you're missing in your lease.
Right. So, those are, and we have to be gentle about, sometimes, behind the curtain, you're kind of like, I wouldn't even pay me to read this. I would just start over. But sometimes that doesn't work. The landlords are, fussy and want their own forms and things like that. But so size is really the very last thing. The length of the document is the very last thing we would use in determining what kind of complexity and revision are going to be required for a commercial lease. So they kind of depend. I know that's like the standard lawyer answer that everyone hates, is it depends. You're talking, a few $1,000s typically in these leases to not only review them, but to provide the commentary and turn you on to the pitfalls. Some people just want that information and then they go negotiate themselves. So we can, help in a consultative fashion to say, okay, go do this, and then you go do it, or we can take over and do it for you. So,
Yeah.
Those things, sometimes people are, this is my 5th space with the same landlord. I just want to have a spot check. And some people are like, but I've never done this before.
Well,
are you new to the business? Are you just new to this landlord? Are you expanding the business where you used to be from home and now you're taking space? All of those things will have factors in what kind of risk tolerance that the tenant might have.
well, and I would keep in mind, like, for clients, I feel like we are many times educating them on the risks and the pitfalls. And then we have to kind of decide which we want to make an issue of. And it's going to vary client to client based on what they're sensitive to, their particular circumstances, the nature of the business. There's so many different factors involved. So we really have to kind of educate you about a large number of issues. And then we usually narrow it down to a handful that we go back and negotiate. You also have to be careful because with commercial landlords, they're only going to let you wiggle a certain amount in the lease. Sometimes they hold up their hand and say, no, take it or leave it. But I also try to be careful when negotiating these with landlords, because what I don't want to happen is to kill the deal, essentially. And now you've invested this money in negotiating a commercial lease, and we have to start from square one with a new lease and a new landlord. So you don't want that to happen either. But you also want to be educated on the risks that you're assuming. So at least you feel comfortable knowing what you're walking into. You're not looking into a dark room with a flashlight, so to speak. You have an idea of what you're stepping into, what the risks are. Sometimes you can work with your insurance agent to insure against some of these risks.
Yeah.
And, that's really important whenever you're obtaining insurance for whether it's business ventures, construction agreement, lease, whatever it may be. You should be negotiating these agreements in a way where you're only assuming a level of risk that you can obtain insurance for. That's the standard in commercial contracts, and that's what's fair. So if your landlord is making you assume something that you can't even obtain insurance for, they're being unreasonable, and you kind of need to explain it in that manner. And I feel like I've been somewhat successful in negotiating that point whenever I put it in terms like that. Like, hey, Bob landlord, you can obtain insurance for this risk. I can't. So let's meet in the middle here. So,
and if you can't, then maybe there's a price adjustment. There's something that you can work out that will make both sides feel comfortable. But it's really when you don't appreciate that it comes up, now you're being relocated, now they're moving bathrooms, now they're doing this, and you're like, wait a minute, this wasn't supposed to happen. And it's like, well, paragraph 13 says it was absolutely able to happen. So not reading it doesn't mean it won't happen. Unfortunately, we've seen that happen on a time or two.
Yeah. And when it's a problem, it's a problem.
Amen.
Well, I hope everyone was able to stay awake through my my horror stories. But again, we've done this quite a bit. I love working with commercial tenants and landlords. So if anybody has any further questions or specific questions for me, I would love to assist.
Well, thank you so much, and thanks for your time. Thanks everyone who tuned in. If this wasn't enough for you, you can join us next week. We will be back with our business coach, recurring guest, John Seifer, and he's going to be covering a series with us called The Business Owner's F Word and Why Financials Aren't Made for Business Owners. So if you feel bad, like I'm not an accountant, you shouldn't be, and you can tune in next week to figure out exactly what you could be doing better. So thank you so much. We hope you have a great week, and if you need us, email us and let us know. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.